for getting together again, Brian. We wanted to chat for a little bit about things you're familiar with as it relates to the economics and workforce in the state. But for the audience that doesn't know you, maybe you could introduce yourself and a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Sure. I am the director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau, and we're housed in the New Hampshire Department of Employment Security, people who deal with individuals who are unemployed, helping them get back to work. My operation is strictly on the data side. So we track all things economic. This is my third year in state government. I have most of my career in the private sector doing economic analysis as a consultant primarily. So really involved in the challenges facing New Hampshire. And I believe the biggest challenge the state faces is the workforce and our ability to grow it.
And what do you see right now, Brian, as, for example, in the youth population? Usually when we talk about that, it's in the 16 to 24-year-old. What are you seeing for either an uptick in industry participation, some expected, some not? And where are you seeing some industries that are showing some growth as it relates to that population?
Yeah, there's really two distinct patterns for that age group that you talk about. The 16 to 19-year-old teenage group has seen a really positive uptick in their labor force participation. Just as background, for almost 2 decades, Doug, labor force participation among teenagers in New Hampshire had been declining. It had been declining nationally as well. I think we went through a period where, education was seen as the primary responsibility of young people, and work experience was maybe diminished a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily agree with that. And it was problematic for a number of industries that employ young people. So really, since the pandemic, we've seen a substantial increase in participation in the labor force of 16 to 19-year-olds. And some of that, Doug, is simply the fact that there was more opportunities and wages were raised really dramatically.
Sure.
For that inexperienced workforce that often starts out in hospitality or retail. So just a quick number, about almost 56% of individuals 16 to 19 on average over the last year participated in the labor force. That is up 13% from its lows in the early 2000s. So, there's a lot of competition for the attention of young people, and parents want them in music programs or theater, all really good things. But I have to tell you that work experience for young people serves them very, very well as they grow and they get into careers. Individuals who get out of college without any work experience, much more difficult to adjust to a working environment. The 20 to 24 is another matter, however, where we've seen a pretty substantial decline in participation, and particularly since the pandemic. Now, prior to the pandemic, that participation rate had been very, very high for 20 to 24-year-olds. It declined. And I think some of that decline, Doug, is the fact that young people, particularly in that age group, have different ways of earning money that isn't typically W-2 employment. And I think for a lot of them, they don't consider that kind of gig off and on. I can work, make some money for a few months doing something, then I step out of the labor force. I think that's hurting the participation rate among that age group, but it's still a bit problematic for employers, who look for W-2 employees.
Right, sure. Are you seeing any particular income disparities, or it's any particular socioeconomic group that you're saying, I'm starting to see some trends here? What do you say about that?
I do think there's some real positives there, Doug. I think for a couple of reasons. One, really since the pandemic and the strong demand for labor, we've seen a lot of lower skill entry-level jobs see their wages rise more than overall the average. So lower skill entry-level jobs saw much more significant wage increases over the past couple of years than did more experienced and higher skill occupations. And that's just because it was just harder to get those individuals into the jobs. So
Sure.
that helps some of that disparity. But the other large factor, Doug, is I think we're finally getting to a recognition that you don't have to go to an Ivy League school to find a decent opportunity. And people are all of a sudden sort of realizing there are good opportunities in a lot of industries and good paying jobs. And because of that, not everybody who isn't cut out to go to an Ivy League school, but maybe starts out in a 4-year institution and drops out after a couple of years, those people are finding jobs earlier, in good middle income wage jobs. And I think that's helping to, get people who may have seen a greater increase in disparity, move them into the middle income ranges. And I think long term, that's a really positive development.
Are you seeing any particular industry or occupation subset that you say, yeah, as it relates to what I just said, that non-4-year degree, or even in the certificate training, what are you seeing in that?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of a lot of industries are now recognizing that they don't need individuals always to have a 4-year degree. I think that is one of the things that's really significant, changing over the last several years. I think we went through a period of time, Doug, where employers were starting to really devalue the high school diploma because they didn't feel that it was particularly relevant for the workforce. So individuals with just a high school degree, I think that's begun to change. I think partly because secondary schools are beginning to understand the importance of having individuals understand the labor force, understand more about work, giving them more real life experiences and opportunities. So as a result of that, I think employers are starting to realize that they do not need to hire everybody who has a 4-year degree, and even maybe a 2-year degree, as long as people have relevant experience, as long as they have some training programs. So that's really across the board. There's always industries, Doug, that will employ people without 4-year degrees or maybe without 2-year degrees. Certainly that, the construction industry's wonderful opportunities for individuals with either some some training, either in apprenticeships or
Sure.
even in certificates. We're seeing it in information industries, a lot of computer related. Not everybody needs to be a systems analyst
Right.
or a computer engineer. I see it in the financial services industry. People who have good interpersonal skills, who, customer relation skills, or people who have just gotten, some level of certificate training. That's an industry where we see a lot. Manufacturing, really great opportunities. Not necessarily high growth in employment, but that workforce, Doug, is turning over. We're seeing new processes, new technologies, and that was an older workforce, so people are stepping out. So you see tremendous opportunities for things like, machinists, people who can operate computer-aided, manufacturing, CNC machines, digitally. That whole workforce is among the oldest in the state, and as those people retire, we're creating a lot of opportunities. One of the openings that I see most frequently in the job openings and postings data is for machinists, and that's a wonderful middle income wage.
Yeah.
So I think I hate to say this, though, there's the only industry I can think of, Doug, that maybe that doesn't apply to is in the professional services.
Okay.
Where you have to have a degree, either a bachelor's or more likely an advanced or professional degree. But other than that, almost every industry, we're seeing more opportunities for people who have some level of education beyond secondary, but not necessarily a degree program.
That's really amazing news, and I think something that many of the audience has kind of known or kind of
Yeah,
suspected, but not
yeah,
necessarily had seen the data that substantiates
yeah,
that. Brian, talk a little bit, if you can, about how you think housing or the shortage of housing could be impacting
yeah.
either the 16 and 19-year-old or the 20 plus.
Yeah.
How is that impacting what's happening in our growth?
Yeah, it's impacting all of our growth. It's a really significant problem. One of the things about New Hampshire that historically has been important is that we rely a lot on people moving from other places into our state in
Sure.
order for our labor force to grow. We have, unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, but it's really a sign of our success. We have really low birth rates in our state, and we have low birth rates because we have women who, compared to the national average, have higher levels of educational attainment, and they participate in the labor force in considerably higher percentages. And that's kind of a recipe for smaller families, which means lower birth rates. So we need people, and this is what's happened over the last several decades, people moving into the state in order for our labor force to really grow to accommodate all the jobs that we're creating. Unfortunately, we've had a big influx over the last few years. Pandemic
Right.
made a lot of people look to more less densely populated areas, rural areas, smaller cities like New Hampshire has. We've always attracted people from the Northeast. We saw a big influx over the last couple of years, but we're having a very hard time accommodating that because we do not have enough housing. We started before the pandemic probably about 20,000 housing units shy of what we really need to accommodate
Mm.
our workforce. Since the pandemic, we've probably added close to 10,000 more, the need for more
Need more
units.
for it.
So
Yeah, sure.
yeah, so what it's done a couple of things. It's prevented some people who would come here from coming here. It has raised the prices for everyone. It's particularly problematic for the young workforce because we haven't built a lot of housing. A lot of people who would normally be buying houses are kind of stuck in the rental market,
Sure.
and that's driven up all the new people who are starting their households are entering a rental market that is just bulging because of people who couldn't buy a house. So that's driven up our rental prices, which is particularly problematic. It's problematic for everyone, but it's particularly problematic for younger folks who are looking to establish their own households,
Sure.
either with people or on their own. So I see it as a big problem. It is part and parcel to our overall labor force shortage problem in the state. They're really interrelated, Doug.
That's great. That's not great, but it's, I think, good news for people to understand
Yeah,
how much housing is really impacting our ability to either grow forward, go
yeah,
forward, or somewhat stagnate until we get
right.
that sort of fixed. So, beyond what you said, Brian, is there any particular trend overall for this age population that really sticks out as being magnificent in some way, shape, or form that you've seen
Yeah.
from an economic perspective?
No, I think my biggest positive takeaway has been the increase in participation among young people in the labor force, particularly that 16 to 19. I think we've come out of what I call kind of the dark side, the notion
Sure.
that kids really don't need to be thinking about work or obtaining work skills when they're young. They only need to worry about getting music lessons
Sure.
or
Yep.
athletics or whatever. So that bodes well for New Hampshire's labor force overall. I think one of the things that has made New Hampshire's workforce really outstanding and with a very positive reputation is the fact that we had among traditionally the highest labor force participation rates among young people, that teenage group. And we had it because we had industries that employ a lot of young people, that give young people their first work experience: retail, hospitality, recreation. That's where they learn the essence of what it's like to be employed, showing up on time, being
Sure.
responsible, working
Sure.
with others. Um, when that declined, I began to think, well, eventually our workforce pays a price for that. That fact that it's increasing again, and I think it will likely remain because there's going to continue to be good opportunities for young people. It bodes very well for New Hampshire's overall economic performance, the quality of our workforce, and the workforce's reputation in the state.
That's excellent. Well, Brian, thank you so much for being here. There's 100 other questions we could ask, and there's so much more time, but we really appreciate your time giving a perspective on the economics in this age group. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, anytime.